Good day and welcome to Teddy Talks to Parents, where expert advice meets everyday parenting. In today's discussion, we'll be diving into the complexities of divorce and how it affects your children. We'll look into the psychological toll that divorce has, the dangers of an ugly divorce, and the misnomer around parents staying together for their children. We are joined today by Dr. Giada Del Fabbro, a clinical and forensic psychologist with a specialization in psychology of criminal behavior and how psychotherapy can assist people in living more productive and fulfilling lives. She has significant experience working with families in custody battles, conducting forensic assessments to determine optimal living conditions for children of divorce. Good day, Dr. Fabbro, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good day, and thank you for having me on your podcast.
So, Dr. Fabbro, divorce can pose significant dangers to children, impacting their emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Research indicates that children of divorce often experience heightened levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, affecting their overall development and even academic performance. So why do children experience these issues? Why does the process of divorce impact children so heavily?
So I think in terms of the way it impacts children, a lot of it depends on the children's developmental stage, their ages, the way that the divorce is happening, if it's amicable and civil or if it's very acrimonious. But the bottom line is that, the breakup of a family is never good for kids. Saying that, it has to happen sometimes. And so children never really want their parents to split. Their fantasy is always that they grow up in an intact household. So obviously the individual child's own vulnerabilities will play a part in how they make sense of the divorce and how much support they get also. So what it really is a process of having to restructure their world, restructure their routines, restructure their assumptions about how time is spent, who they spend time with. There might also be, in terms of cultural or even religious communities, there may be a sense of shame or concern about how they'll be judged. So some of the outcomes of all these issues that the children have to deal with, and the way in which it's dealt with and the support they have, may be in anxiety symptoms, depression symptoms, trauma symptoms sometimes, if there's been violence or substance abuse that just contributed to the end of the marriage. And generally you'll find out, especially the younger the child, but even in terms of adolescents, you'll find that they act out the stuff that they're going through. So the school is probably the place where you'll notice most that children are not coping with the divorce.
Okay. And then what can parents do to kind of mitigate these sort of traumas and anxieties, etc.? How can parents kind of guide their children through this process of divorce?
So there's different paths and situations that lead to divorce. But if there's a lot of conflict between the parents, I think first place to start is to not expose the children to this. To try and manage and regulate their own emotions so that they can engage constructively and civilly in front of the children. Because it's really difficult for children if they feel that one parent hates the other or they hate each other, because in their minds they love both. And it creates a conflict within the child's mind and emotions around loyalties, around where they're positioned. So if the parents can present a united front to the children in terms of how they speak to the children about the divorce and what is happening, that will be first prize. And I think explanation is really key here, so that the children are spoken to about what is happening, perhaps in appropriate ways, the reasons for which it is happening, but that they are reassured that they are loved by each parent, and that those relationships will be supported and reinforced. And to explain to the children a little bit about what will happen, what the process will be. If it doesn't go to court and it's not acrimonious, then we're about discussing with them how they would spend time with each parent. Letting them have a voice in terms of their room in another residence. So outside of the primary residence, in terms of the parent that's exercising sort of contact, to have an active say around what that looks like. and to really contain and support whatever emotions come up for the children. So I think for parents who are dealing with their own sadness, anger, difficulties around the end of the marriage, it can be hard then to set that aside to deal with children's anger, sadness, hurt, fear, anxiety. So I think there needs to be mindfulness around that. And perhaps if the parent is struggling, to engage in outside support. So therapy, speak to teachers, let them know what's happening. So if the child is underperforming at school or struggling, the teacher can contextualize it and perhaps provide support from that point of view.
So you just touched on a little bit about kind of how parents' own baggage kind of influences their children. So what can parents do? I mean, they can obviously assist their child through the process, but what can they do for themselves? I mean, a lot of parents we're kind of speaking to here might not have the luxury of seeking out counselling. So what advice can you offer them?
So in order to best care for their children, they need to look after themselves first. And I know it sounds almost contradictory or counterintuitive, but I think if the parent is in an emotional space where they cannot be there for their child and they might lash out or they might neglect the child emotionally, I think it's important to take space where they can to process their own feelings and then to engage with the child and support them. So that might be around journaling, writing down what they're going through, what they're feeling. That can often help to sort of sort through feelings and manage them and think of constructive ways of dealing with them. Reach out to friends. If there's a religious community and churches, or there's a religious support group and support base. Maybe it's through prayer, through talking to people in the community. But I think it's really important for the parents to care for themselves so that they can be there for their children.
Okay. So, while it's not as popular anymore, there are still parents who choose to kind of stay together in loveless marriages because they think it's in the best interests of their children. Is that kind of a misnomer? And what does that do to a child's kind of perceptions of a relationship?
So this idea of staying together for the children is really never a good idea. And why that is because children are quite perceptive and sensitive, and they will pick up on tension, even if the parents are trying to be civil and but actually don't feel anything for one another or actually resent one another. Children will pick up on that, and I think that will create anxiety for the child because they're feeling something but they're seeing something else, so it's confusing. The other thing is it models a kind of relationship which I imagine many parents wouldn't want for their children, which is, what it's saying is that this is what a relationship looks like. You really don't care for one another, maybe you don't even respect the other person, or you feel nothing, and yet this is what a relationship is. So children will then grow up and replicate that kind of relationship in their adult lives. So as hard as it may be, the best thing for a child is to see that whatever they're feeling between their parents, it matches the actions, and that it's not the end of the world if a relationship ends and one has an opportunity to pursue other relationships that might be more constructive and healthy. And the child will then see that. And as long as they're reassured that, their father will always be their father, their mother will always be their mother, and that there's respect between the parents or partners. It's not necessarily father and mother always. That will be important.
Okay. And so now kind of the parents have agreed that divorce is the best thing, but often it's a lengthy process. I mean, we know our judicial system is slow. So how can you prepare children for that process? I mean, it doesn't necessarily always go to court, but it quite often does. So how can you guide them through that process?
So children very rarely go to court in divorce cases. What will happen is generally it will end up at the family advocate, and they'll be interviewed by a social worker at the family advocate, and then they draw up a report of recommendations around how the divorce agreement should take place. So I think it's about explaining to the child, because already at that point there's different permutations. So it might be that you're still living in the same home but separate bedrooms. It might be that one parent has moved out. And I think in those cases it's very important that even though there's not an agreement in place, the children still have time with the parent that's not at their residence. So you try and support those relationships and stabilize them as much as possible. And I think inform the children every step of the way, the progress. And again, this is really not about sharing details of the divorce, which a lot of divorcing parents do, which is actually not appropriate at all. Children should not know the details of who's paying what and the difficulties with that or the conflict aspects. But it's just to say that, you're separating. The previous things we referred to around reassuring the children, and then to give them a guideline to say, this is probably going to be, you're probably going to need to be involved at this point, but we're sorting it out. In fact, if you can establish contact and sort of residential arrangements in the process of going through the divorce, the children actually don't even need to know what's happening in terms of the divorce. They will need to be informed if they need to go and see the social worker, or if the arrangements that you've come up with together change for some reason after the agreement is legalized and made formal as a court order. But I think this is probably more, but just to really inform them when there's going to be a change to their schedule or routine in some way.
Okay. And we both kind of know that routine is so vital to children. And quite often, once parents have kind of separated and gone through the process, generally you'll have kind of one house of residence for a child to maintain that sort of routine, and you might see your other parent on the weekends. But I've heard of circumstances where parents will actually split up week on, week off with their children. Is that productive for the child? Can they kind of still maintain those routines in two completely separate households?
So I think what the key aspects to any divorce, whatever the arrangement is the co-parenting. And I think if parents can co-parent effectively, then and each parent will have their own style. So it's not about parents having the same style of parenting, but it's about being in agreement on things like routine, on like how much screen time is a good idea, or how much the extramurals and the arrangements. So I think that's important. In terms of it depends on the children and the child and the situation. So I think for some children really battle with 1 week on, 1 week off. And some parents battle with that, but obviously the child is at the center of the arrangements. And in that situation, it's really important that the child has everything they need at the other home. So they're not responsible for lugging things back and forwards between homes, which inevitably some stuff gets left behind or forgotten and the child feels bad, etc. There's also 3 days on, 4 days. There's different kind of custody arrangements and contact arrangements that can take place, but it very much depends on the children, what each parent is capable of offering. Some parents may not have the time or the resources to have their children with them for a week. So it may be that weekends and 1 day in the week works better. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. Well, wonderful. That's unfortunately all we have time for today. A big thank you to you for your incredible guidance and advice. It's really appreciated. Find us next week for more helpful tips and suggestions from your trusted experts. Teddy Talks to Parents is proudly produced by the Teddy Bear Foundation, where children go on their journey to healing. Thank you, and see you next week.